The dust settled over the broken wagon wheel as Gideon lay in the dirt, breathing through the intense pain of his crushed leg, knowing his time as a useful cowboy was finished. He had lost his horse and his wages in the rockslide, leaving him with nothing but a ruined body and a quiet, heavy despair. The frontier did not forgive weakness, and a man who could not stand was a man who no longer mattered. He closed his eyes, accepting the bitter end of his until a massive shadow fell over him and blocked the harsh afternoon sun. He opened his eyes and saw a woman who seemed carved from the very mountains themselves. Johanna stood over him, her sheer height and massive build unlike anything he had ever seen in all his years on the trail. Her simple red dress stretched tightly across her wildly muscular frame, the sleeves torn away to reveal broad shoulders and thick biceps that carried immense physical power. She possessed heavily muscular thighs and a broad back, yet her strong face held remarkably gentle, feminine lines. Gideon tried to push himself up, desperate to preserve his remaining dignity, but the blinding pain forced him back into the dry earth. He knew he would die in this canyon if he was left alone, but his pride made the thought of rescue feel like a deep defeat. Johanna knelt beside him, her giant hands moving with unexpected grace and quiet care. She did not speak, simply sliding one massive arm under his broad shoulders and the other beneath his knees. She lifted him from the earth as easily as if he were a small child, pulling him securely against her broad chest. Gideon felt a sudden flush of humiliation burn in his throat. A grown man carried by a woman, entirely stripped of his pride and independence. "Welcome to the fire, friends. Pull up a chair and let me tell you a story about finding worth when the world says you have none. Let me know where you are listening from today." Johanna turned her back to the ruined wagon and began the long walk toward the distant town of Caven. Gideon listened to the heavy, rhythmic thud of her chunky leather boots against the trail, feeling the immense physical strength radiating from her body. He noticed the thick cords of muscle in her arms and the profound endurance required to carry, without a single pause or complaint. For his entire life, Gideon had been the one to protect others, the one to endure the heavy labor of the ranch, the one to stand strong when things fell apart. Now he was completely helpless, forced to rely on a giant woman whose physical power made him feel incredibly small and fragile. He kept his face turned away, hiding his but Johanna seemed to understand his silent struggle. She kept her eyes focused on the horizon, allowing him his silence, holding him not like a heavy burden but like a life that still held genuine value. She spoke softly, her voice calm and steady, telling him about the trees and the shape of the clouds, giving him something to listen to other than his own failure. The long miles passed, and his burning humiliation slowly faded into a quiet, reluctant awe. Gideon realized she was carrying him with a deep, careful respect, making sure his broken leg did not shift or cause him unnecessary pain. When the weathered wooden buildings of Oakhaven finally appeared in the distance, the quiet atmosphere between them suddenly shifted. Johanna slowed her pace, her massive shoulders stiffening, her posture growing rigid and defensive. As they entered the main street, the townsfolk stopped their wagons and dropped their tools, their eyes widening at the towering, heavily muscular woman carrying a grown cowboy. Cruel whispers began to echo from the wooden boardwalks, harsh murmurs about a beast, a freak of nature, a dangerous giant who did not belong among civilized people. Johanna tightened her grip on him, her jaw setting in a firm line as she absorbed the cruelty of their public judgment. Gideon felt the immense power of her body tremble, not from his weight, but from the heavy, invisible burden of their stares. He realized then that she lived with a wound far deeper than his crushed, an isolation built by the fear and prejudice of others. He could have closed his eyes, pretending to be unconscious, letting her face the ridicule alone while he protected his own reputation in the town. Instead, Gideon forced himself to sit up slightly in her arms, ignoring the blinding pain radiating through his leg. He looked directly at the crowd, his weathered face hardening into a sigh. using the last remnants of his strength to command respect. He told them to clear a wide path for the lady, his voice rough, echoing through the sudden silence of the dusty street. The townsfolk stepped back in shock, surprised by the fierce protection coming from the broken man in her arms. Johanna looked down at him, a flicker of genuine surprise in her eyes, before she straightened her spine and lifted her chin. She carried him forward with renewed dignity, stepping through the divided crowd with steady, confident strides. Gideon leaned against her shoulder, knowing they had absolutely nowhere to go, but entirely certain that he would not let this town break her spirit. The crowd parted in silence as Johanna carried the injured cowboy through Oakhaven. Gideon kept his jaw tight, refusing to let the townspeople see his pain or the ruin of his pride. Johanna walked with heavy steps, ignoring the cruel whispers that resumed the moment they passed the general store. She carried him directly to the small wooden clinic at the end of the street. She kicked the door open gently, stepping into the dim interior. Dr. Miller looked up from his desk, his eyes widening at the sight of the heavily muscular woman filling his door. He stood up nervously as Johanna lowered Gideon onto the examination table. She stepped away, crossing her arms over her broad chest, watching closely as the physician approached his patient. Gideon gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as the older man examined his crushed leg. The room remained quiet except for the ragged sound of Gideon drawing breath. Dr. Miller pressed his fingers along the broken bones, shaking his head slowly. He told Gideon that the damage was severe, the bones shattered in a way that would take months to heal, and that he would likely walk with a heavy limp for the rest of his life. Gideon absorbed the words like a physical blow, staring at the cracked ceiling, realizing his years as an independent ranch hand were permanently finished. The doctor wrapped the leg tightly in heavy bandages, applying wooden splints to keep the shattered bones rigid. He wiped his hands and mentioned, looking uncomfortably between the broken cowboy and the towering woman. Gideon reached toward his empty pockets, remembering his wages were lost in the canyon. He told the doctor he would send the money once he found work. The older man frowned, explaining he could not extend credit to a drifting cowboy with a ruined leg. Johanna stepped forward, her massive frame casting a long shadow across the room. She reached into the pocket of her red dress and pulled out a small leather pouch. She opened it with her thick fingers, counting out the silver coins required to settle the debt, placing them quietly on the wooden desk. Gideon felt a fresh wave of humiliation, his deep pride fighting the reality of his helplessness. He told her sharply that he did not take charity from anyone, promising he would repay every cent through his own labor. Johanna looked at him with calm eyes, unaffected by his sudden temper. She recognized that a man stripped of his physical strength needed to hold onto his remaining dignity. She simply told him the silver was a loan, not charity, and that she expected him to keep his word when his body healed. Her quiet voice carried a deep respect that caught Gideon by surprise. He slowly nodded, feeling a strange relief that she did not treat him like a helpless. Dr. Miller warned that moving Gideon again would risk further damage to the bones. Johanna nodded once, sliding her massive arms beneath Gideon, lifting him with the same effortless grace she had shown on the trail. Gideon allowed his heavy head to rest against her shoulder as she carried him back into the harsh sun. She bypassed the local boarding house, knowing the owners would never allow a woman of her unusual size to rent a decent room. Instead, she carried him to the edge of town, where a small cabin sat isolated near the tree line. It was a humble place, entirely removed from the judging eyes of the townspeople, offering a safe refuge for a gentle woman avoiding public stares. Johanna pushed the wooden door open, revealing a clean interior with a stone fireplace and a sturdy bed. She laid Gideon down carefully, adjusting the heavy blankets over his shivering frame, making sure his broken leg was secure. Gideon watched her move around the small cabin, noticing the unexpected gentleness in her giant hands as she poured fresh water from a clay pitcher. He realized she lived completely alone, isolated by the fears of ordinary people. Yet she possessed a quiet strength that had nothing to do with her heavy muscles. She brought him a tin cup of water, supporting his broad shoulders as he drank, her proximity offering a strange comfort. He thanked her softly, his rough voice heavy with exhaustion, admitting he did not even know her full name. She told him her name was Johanna, her eyes dropping to the floorboards, expecting him to mock her towering size. Gideon held her steady gaze, speaking her name with quiet respect, promising again he would not be a permanent burden to her life. Johanna walked to the window, her broad shoulders tense with an unspoken worry. She turned back to him, revealing that the isolated cabin did not actually belong to her, and the harsh landowner was arriving tomorrow to collect the rent she no longer had, having spent her last silver coins to pay the doctor. Gideon stared at her, realizing her immense kindness had just placed them both in absolute jeopardy. The morning sun had barely crested the tree line when the heavy thud of approaching hooves woke Gideon. He shifted on the narrow bed, his shattered leg sending a sharp warning of pain up his spine. Johanna was already awake. She stood by the small iron stove, her broad back tense under the simple fabric of her red dress. She did not look at him as she walked to the wooden door, her chunky leather boots making a deliberate sound against the floorboards. Gideon listened as a horse stopped in the dirt outside. A harsh, impatient voice demanded the rent. Johanna stepped onto the porch, her towering frame blocking the morning light. She spoke in a low, respectful tone, explaining that the silver had been spent on a medical emergency and asking for a few days of grace. The landowner, a bitter man named Silas, laughed cruelly. He told her she was a spectacle, a dangerous freak of nature who was lucky. He even let her hide out in his ruined cabin, and ordered her to pack her things by noon. Gideon felt a cold fury settle deep in his chest. His pride could not bear the thought of this giant, gentle woman losing her sanctuary because she had chosen to save his life. He gritted his teeth against the blinding pain in his, pulling himself up against the solid wooden headboard. He called out to the landowner, his voice rough and carrying the absolute authority of a man who had run cattle drives across the worst country in the territory. Silas leaned over in his saddle, peering past Johanna into the dim cabin. Gideon did not flinch. He introduced himself, stating his name and his history as a working hand for the major ranches. He pointed out the frayed leather of the bridle on Silas's horse and failing stitching on his saddlebags. Gideon offered a hard, practical bargain. He promised to repair and oil every piece of broken leather and harness on the man's property, while Johanna would clear the heavy fallen timber blocking the lower creek, a brutal job Silas had been complaining about for months. Silas looked up at the towering woman, measuring her massive shoulders and incredibly thick biceps. He knew no ordinary man could clear that waterlogged timber without a strong mule team. But the giant woman standing before him possessed immense physical power. He agreed to give them 1 week, dropping a heavy sack of ruined leather gear onto the porch before riding away. The dust settled, leaving a fragile, heavy silence in the cabin. Johanna carried the sack inside, setting it gently on the floor near the bed. She looked at Gideon with a mixture of quiet gratitude and deep concern. She knew his hands were skilled, but she also saw he was burning with a mild fever from his terrible injuries. Gideon simply asked for his knife and a sharp awl. For the first time since the rockslide took his horse and his livelihood, he finally had a real job to do. Johanna left the cabin to face the heavy timber at the creek. Through the open window, Gideon listened to the rhythmic, powerful strikes of her heavy axe echoing through the valley. The sound became a deep comfort to him, a steady reminder of her immense endurance and quiet, unwavering dedication. He focused on the leather, his calloused fingers working the stiff material, repairing torn straps and replacing rusted buckles. His body was badly broken, but his hands remembered the honorable trade he had learned over decades on the open frontier. The crushing helplessness he had felt in the dirt by the ruined wagon will slowly began to fade into memory, He was providing for his keep, earning his daily plate, and protecting the brave woman who had carried him away from the fire. When evening finally fell, the door opened, and Johanna stepped inside. She was covered in pale trail dust and dark sweat, her massive chest heaving from hours of grueling physical labor. She washed her heavy hands at the basin, her movements unusually slow and deliberate. Gideon watched her carefully, noticing the deep, silent exhaustion etched into the gentle lines of her strong face. He held up a beautifully repaired leather, asking her to help him pull a thick wax thread tight. She stepped closer, hesitating for a moment, afraid her massive strength would snap the delicate leather or accidentally jostle his broken leg. Gideon reached out, his weathered hands gently guiding her thick fingers, showing her the exact tension required to lock the stitch. They worked together in the dim, warm lantern light, the quiet proximity creating a new, unspoken bond of trust between them. Johanna looked at the restored leather with genuine admiration, telling him his work was fine and beautiful. Gideon felt a quiet warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the evening fire. He had feared becoming a useless burden, but she made him feel like a man who still had immense value to give. They had bought themselves a week of safety, a temporary victory against a harsh and judging world. However, when Johanna turned away from the bed to fetch a fresh cup of water, her heavy legs suddenly buckled beneath her. She caught herself hard on the wooden table, her massive frame trembling violently. Gideon sat forward, his heart sinking as he realized the terrible, hidden cost of their bargain. She was doing the brutal labor of an entire crew just to keep a roof over his injured head. The realization shifted everything in his mind, proving that remaining in the safe cabin was slowly destroying the very woman he desperately wanted to protect. Gideon reached out as Johanna caught herself heavily against the wooden table. He ignored the sharp pain in his shattered leg and pulled himself forward on the narrow. He demanded that she sit down in the chair beside him. Johanna tried to straighten her massive shoulders and hide her exhaustion, but her thick arms trembled uncontrollably. She sank into the chair, her blonde hair falling forward to hide her face. Gideon looked closely at her and realized the terrible truth. He asked what she had eaten since they arrived. Johanna kept her eyes focused on the floorboards and quietly admitted she had given the last portion of their dried meat and beans to him so his broken bones could heal. The heavy realization hit Gideon like a physical blow. He had believed his bargain with the landowner was safe, but he had blindly pushed this gentle giant of a woman to the absolute edge of starvation. She was sacrificing her own body to keep him safe and fed. He felt a profound surge of protective anger, not at her, but at his own blindness. He reached across the small distance and placed his calloused hand over her thick, bruised knuckles. He told her in a low, unwavering voice that she was forbidden from lifting that heavy axe again until she had eaten a proper meal. Johanna looked up, genuine surprise in her gentle eyes, entirely unaccustomed to anyone caring about her physical limits. People always assumed her massive frame meant she could endure endless suffering without consequence. Gideon released her hand and pulled the heavy sack of ruined leather onto his lap. He worked through the long night by the dim light of the lantern. His fingers moved with practiced precision, cutting, oiling, and stitching the broken material. He took the finest pieces of salvaged saddle leather and crafted a beautiful, intricately tooled set of riding reins and a sturdy saddlebag. It was mastercraft work, born from decades of pride on the open frontier. When the morning sun finally broke through the window, Gideon handed the finished leather to Johanna. He gave her strict instructions to walk into the center of Oakhaven and enter the general store. He told her not to lower her eyes and not to apologize for her size. He explained that the mercantile owner would recognize the exceptional quality of the leather. Immediately, she was to trade the gear for flour, bacon, fresh bandages, and coffee, and she was to accept nothing less than full value. Johanna traced the beautiful stitching with her thick fingers, terrified of facing the cruel whispers of the townspeople again. Gideon held her steady gaze, his weathered face filled with absolute belief in her dignity. He told her she was a partner in this work, not a beggar, and she had every right to walk the main street. Johanna gathered her courage, stepped out of the cabin, and made the long walk into Oakhaven. As she entered the dusty street, the familiar harsh murmurs began. People stopped and stared at the towering, wildly muscular woman in the simple red dress. She felt her chest tighten with anxiety, but she remembered the quiet respect in Gideon's voice. She kept her broad shoulders back and walked straight into the mercantile. The store owner, Abernathy, backed away as her massive frame filled his shop. Johanna did not say a word about her size. She simply laid the beautifully repaired saddlebag and reins on the wooden counter. Abernathy looked at the gear, his eyes widening in complete shock. He ran his hands over the flawless stitching and the supple oiled leather. He knew instantly that work of this caliber was rare and highly valuable. He looked up at Johanna, the fear in his eyes slowly replacing with a calculation. He asked who had crafted such fine gear. Johanna spoke with a calm, steady pride, telling him it was the work of her partner, Gideon, and that they were willing to trade. Abernathy eagerly gathered provisions, offering prime bacon, flour, and medical supplies, desperate to secure trade for more of the exceptional goods. For the first time in her life, the people in the store looked at Johanna not as a dangerous freak of nature, but as a respected agent of a valuable business. She walked out of the mercantile with her arms full of supplies and her head held high. When she returned to the cabin, Gideon saw the quiet, beautiful pride shining in her eyes. They cooked a real meal together, sharing the fresh bacon and hot coffee in a warm, comfortable silence. Johanna felt a deep, overwhelming gratitude, realizing Gideon had given her something far more valuable than food. He had given her public dignity. She watched him eat, feeling a powerful affection growing in her chest for this broken, honorable cowboy. But as the evening shadows stretched across the floorboards, her gentle face clouded with a new, heavy worry. She set her tin cup on the table and told Gideon what she had overheard in the mercantile. Silas, the bitter landowner, was at the local saloon telling the town sheriff that a wild beast of a woman had kidnapped an injured cowboy and was holding him hostage in the ruined cabin. Silas was demanding the law ride out tomorrow morning to evict her by force so he could seize the valuable leather goods for himself. Gideon set his jaw, staring at the locked wooden door, knowing they were entirely trapped. The heavy silence in the cabin felt colder than the night air outside. Gideon stared at the locked wooden door, his mind racing through the brutal realities of frontier law. He knew exactly how terrified men acted when faced with something they did not understand. Silas had planted a poisonous seed in the town, painting Johanna as a wild beast holding an injured man captive. When the sheriff arrived tomorrow, he would not see a gentle woman who had spent her last silver on medical supplies. He would see a towering, heavily muscular giant, and his first instinct would be violence. Gideon looked over at Johanna. She was sitting by the stove, her broad shoulders slumped, the brief pride she had found at the mercantile overshadowed by the approaching danger. Gideon knew he had to protect her, even if it meant breaking his own heart. He pushed himself up against the headboard, ignoring the throbbing pain in his shattered. He kept his voice low and firm, commanding her to pack the flour and her few possessions into the canvas sack. He told her she had to leave the cabin tonight and head straight up into the high timber where the local posse could never track her. Johanna looked up, genuine confusion in her gentle eyes, asking what would happen to him when the men arrived. Gideon lied, claiming he would tell the law the truth about Silas and wait for his leg to heal. Johanna was too observant to be fooled. She knew Silas would throw a crippled cowboy out into the dirt the moment she was gone. She stood up, her massive frame filling the small room, and shook her head. She spoke with quiet, stubborn resolve, telling him she would not abandon him to a bitter landowner. Gideon felt a sudden, desperate anger born entirely from his fear for her safety. He told her she was acting like a fool, He explained that a posse would not ask questions when they saw her enormous size. They would put her in heavy iron chains, parade her through the dusty street like a captured animal, and lock her away in a dark cell for the rest of her life. His weathered face tightened with raw emotion as he admitted he would rather die alone in this ruined cabin than let her sacrifice her freedom for a broken ranch hand. Johanna stood perfectly still, absorbing the heavy truth of his words. She had spent her entire life drifting from remote mining camps to lonely settlements, always running away in the dark when the fearful stares became too much to bear. She looked at her thick hands, the hands everyone else believed were meant only for brutal labor. Then she walked slowly toward the narrow bed. She did not pack her things, and she did not turn toward the door. Instead, she reached out and placed her massive, calloused fingers gently against Gideon's rough cheek. The touch was incredibly tender, a startling contrast to her overwhelming physical power. She looked down into his observant eyes and told him she was finally done running. She explained that earlier today, because of his absolute belief in her, she had walked into a store and been treated as a respected human being for the very first time. He had given her public dignity, and she refused to walk away from the only man who had ever looked past her wild body to see her actual heart. Gideon felt a tight, painful lump form in his throat. He looked up at this brave woman, realizing his attempt to push her away had only proven how deeply he needed her to stay. He turned his face slightly, resting his jaw against her, accepting a dangerous affection he could no longer deny. The closeness between them had become a profound, terrifying attachment that could cost them everything. They did not sleep that night. Gideon spent the dark hours carving a length of scrap wood into a crude crutch, padding the top with ruined leather. By the time morning light filtered through the dusty window, he was standing, leaning heavily on the wood, gasping as his crushed leg hung uselessly above the floorboards. Johanna stood beside him, her long blonde hair brushed back, her strong face set with quiet dignity. She was terrified, but she did not let her broad shoulders drop. The heavy sound of horses broke the morning stillness, stopping violently in the dirt yard. Leather creaked, and boots hit the ground. Silas yelled toward the cabin, his voice dripping with cruel anticipation, telling the sheriff to break the door and drag the beast out. Gideon tightened his grip on the crutch, determined to shield her with his own broken body. But before the sheriff could strike the wood, another wagon rattled into the yard, and a different voice cut sharply through the cold air, demanding that every man lower his weapon immediately. Gideon recognized the voice, realizing with a sudden shock that the truth of their situation had reached someone else in town, entirely by accident. The heavy wagon came to a halt in the center of the yard, throwing up a thick cloud of pale morning dust. Abernathy, the mercantile owner, climbed down from the driver's seat with surprising speed. Dr. Miller stepped down right behind him, carrying his black medical bag. Abernathy pointed a steady finger directly at Silas and loudly called him a liar. The sheriff turned his horse, asking Abernathy to explain himself before things got out of hand. Abernathy did not back down or lower his voice. He walked straight toward the porch, completely ignoring the armed men, and stopped at the base of the wooden steps. He looked up at Silas and told the entire yard that a wild beast holding a man hostage does not walk politely into a general store to negotiate a fair trade for medical supplies. Abernathy reached into his coat and pulled out the beautifully tooled leather saddlebag Gideon had made the night before. He held it up in the morning light for every man to see, tracing the flawless stitching with his thumb. He declared that the giant woman and the injured cowboy were honest, highly skilled people, and Silas was nothing but a greedy coward trying to use the law to steal mastercraft goods for his own profit. The sheriff looked at the fine leatherwork in Abernathy's hand, then looked carefully at the cabin doorway. Gideon stood leaning heavily on his crude wooden crutch, his weathered face pale with pain, yet his observant eyes burned with fierce defiance. Johanna stood right beside him, her massive shoulders squared, her chin held high, firmly refusing to hide in the shadows. The sheriff did not see a dangerous monster. He saw a proud, injured man and a courageous woman standing together against a cruel bully. The lawman turned a cold gaze on Silas. He told the landowner that filing a false report to steal from an injured man was a serious crime, and he would not let his badge be used for a robbery. The sheriff ordered Silas to get off the property immediately and warned him never to show his face near this cabin again. Silas opened his mouth to argue, but the heavy, judging silence of the posse told him he was completely alone. He yanked his horse around and rode away in humiliating defeat. The tense atmosphere in the yard slowly relaxed. Abernathy walked up the wooden steps, removed his hat, and offered a polite, respectful nod to Johanna. She stared at him in quiet shock, entirely unaccustomed to anyone defending her against an angry crowd. Abernathy looked past her to Gideon and offered a genuine business proposition. He explained that his mercantile had an secure workshop in the back and a small set of living quarters upstairs. The town desperately needed a master leatherworker, and Abernathy needed a reliable, powerful partner to handle the heavy freight arriving on the rail line. He offered them the space, telling them they could build a real, profitable life right in the center of town. They would not have to hide in a ruined cabin at the edge of the woods ever again. The men tipped their hats and rode back toward the main road, leaving Johanna and Gideon completely alone. The fierce adrenaline that had kept Gideon standing suddenly vanished. His crushed leg buckled sharply under his weight. He began to fall toward the hard floorboards, but Johanna was already moving. She caught him easily against her broad chest, her massive muscular arms wrapping around him with incredible gentleness. She carried him back to the narrow bed and laid him down, her thick fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the heavy wool blankets. Gideon closed his eyes, breathing heavily through the sharp agony in his leg, but a profound relief washed over his exhausted body. Johanna sat in the wooden chair beside the bed, her strong face completely overwhelmed by the events of the morning. She looked down at her heavy calloused hands, the giant hands that had only ever known brutal labor and public rejection. She whispered into the quiet room, confessing that she had spent her entire life waiting for the inevitable day a town would drive her out with weapons. She had never allowed herself to imagine a day when a community would actually invite her to stay and offer her a home. Gideon reached out and took her thick hand in his weathered grip. He told her she had earned her true place the moment she walked into that store with her high and refused to apologize for who she was. The quiet intimacy between them shifted into something permanent and deeply undeniable. Gideon looked into her gentle eyes and finally confessed his own darkest fear. He told her he had tried to send her away the night before because he was terrified his broken body would turn her into a lifelong servant. He firmly believed a man who could not walk the open range was a man who could not be a real partner. Johanna shook her head slowly, brushing a strand of wild blonde hair from her face. She leaned closer, her voice soft but filled with absolute certainty. She told Gideon that true strength was not found in a strong back or massive muscles. She told him his true strength was his honorable heart, his skilled hands, and the incredible way he made her feel entirely safe in a deeply cruel world. The heavy walls of pride and fear they had built around their lonely lives finally shattered completely. However, the generous offer from Abernathy meant leaving the isolated safety of the woods and moving directly into the crowded center of town tomorrow morning. Johanna had never lived permanently in the public eye, and Gideon knew this drastic transition would test every ounce of the fragile trust they had just built. Johanna loaded the canvas sacks into the mercantile wagon, sitting beside Gideon as they rode into the center of Oakhaven. The journey felt like crossing a dangerous ocean. For her entire life, Johanna had survived by staying invisible. Now she was traveling down the main street in the bright morning sun. People stopped on the boardwalks to stare at her massive muscular frame. Johanna gripped the wooden bench, her broad shoulders tight. Gideon reached across the seat and covered her thick hand with his calloused fingers. He did not speak, but his steady touch anchored her against the weight of the public. Abernathy led them to the mercantile workshop, a sturdy room with a wide table, a clean iron stove, and a private loft upstairs. Gideon immediately arranged his tools, finding comfort in the familiar smell of oiled leather. When the afternoon supply wagons arrived, Johanna stepped to the heavy tailgates. She lifted enormous wooden crates of iron tools and heavy sacks of grain, carrying them into the storage room with effortless grace. The delivery drivers watched in complete silence, their initial fear replaced by a stunned respect for her immense physical power. She was no longer a hidden beast, but a vital and respected part of the town commerce. A comfortable rhythm soon settled over their lives. Gideon crafted beautiful leather goods that drew customers from across the territory. Johanna handled the heavy freight, earning a steady wage and cautious acceptance from the locals. They shared quiet suppers by the hot stove, tired but deeply content. Johanna found a profound peace in the routine. She loved watching Gideon work, his hands moving with precision despite the constant pain radiating from his ruined leg. They were building a real home, day by day, proving they belonged in the world. This fragile peace broke on a cold Tuesday afternoon. A brutal, hard-eyed man named Vance pushed open the door to the workshop. Vance ran a dangerous high-mountain freight company. He ignored Gideon entirely and stared directly at Johanna, measuring her towering height and thick biceps like a man inspecting a workhorse. He announced that a mudslide had trapped his heavy supply wagon on a narrow cliff pass. Mules could not gain footing in the deep mud, and his crew was too weak to lift the axles. He slapped a heavy pouch on the workbench, declaring it held $50 in solid gold. He demanded Johanna come to the mountain and physically drag the wagon free. Gideon dropped his tools, his weathered face darkening with fierce anger. He recognized the mountain pass Vance mentioned. It was a lethal, unstable drop that had claimed the lives of seasoned men. He told the freight owner in a cold, unyielding voice that Johanna was not a draft animal for hire. Gideon ordered Vance to take his gold and get out of the shop. Vance sneered, calling him a broken cripple, but the absolute fury in the cowboy observant eyes forced the man to back away. Vance snatched the pouch and left, muttering that the offer remained open if the giant woman decided to be useful. Gideon turned to Johanna, his chest heaving with protective rage. He promised he would never let anyone treat her like a brute laborer again. Johanna nodded quietly, but her gentle eyes remained fixed on the empty spot on the workbench where the gold had rested. Later that evening, while Gideon was resting upstairs, Johanna walked over to the local clinic. She asked Dr. Miller a single, direct question. The doctor confirmed her hidden suspicion, admitting that a specialist in the eastern city could permanently repair shattered bones, but the train fare and the surgical fee would cost exactly $50. A crushing realization settled over her heart. She returned to the workshop, watching Gideon from the doorway. He leaned heavily against the table, rubbing his ruined leg, his face tight with chronic pain. She loved him deeply, and she knew his greatest wound was the loss of his physical pride and his independence. She believed that if he was fully healed, he could reclaim his life as a true cowboy on the open frontier. She also believed, deep in her damaged self-worth, that her only true value was her massive physical strength. When the midnight shadows filled the room, Gideon woke to the sound of heavy leather boots moving softly across the floorboards. He pulled himself up and saw Johanna standing by the door in her canvas coat. Her blonde hair was tied back, and her strong face was set with a heartbreaking resolve. Gideon grabbed his crutch, demanding to know where she was going. Johanna looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She confessed she was going to the mountain pass to pull the wagon. She told him the gold would buy his surgery, giving him back his open frontier and his lost pride. Gideon felt his blood run cold as the terrible reality of her sacrifice hit him. She was entirely willing to risk a lethal cliff simply to fix his broken body. He stepped forward, leaning his entire weight on the wooden crutch, desperately telling her that his pride was not worth her life. He told her she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and he would gladly walk with a heavy limp for the rest of his days if it meant she stayed by his side. Johanna placed her massive hand gently on the iron latch. She smiled a sad, gentle smile, whispering that a good man deserved a whole life, even if she had to walk away to buy it for him. She opened the heavy door, stepping out into the freezing dark, leaving Gideon standing alone to face the devastating reality of what her love for him actually cost. Gideon did not hesitate for a single second. He threw his weight onto his crude wooden crutch, ignoring the tearing pain in his shattered, and hauled himself out into the freezing night air. He dragged his body down the dark street to Abernathy, pounding on the door until the mercantile owner opened it in surprise. Gideon explained where Johanna had gone and what she was risking on the mountain pass. Abernathy did not waste a moment. He hitched his heavy team to the store wagon, helped Gideon up into the bench seat, and drove the horses up the steep mountain trail into the cold darkness. They reached the high cliff pass just as the first gray light of dawn broke over the sharp rocks. Vance stood on the mud-slicked trail, shouting cruel orders at Johanna, who had wrapped a thick tow rope around her broad shoulders. Her massive muscular frame was braced against the weight of the stalled freight wagon, her heavy leather boots digging deep into the frozen earth. One slip on the narrow, icy ledge would send her and the heavy wagon plummeting into the canyon below. Vance was treating her like an expendable beast, demanding she pull before the mud gave way completely. Gideon did not wait for Abernathy to bring the horses to a complete stop. He pulled himself out of the wagon seat, swinging forward on his crutch, his voice echoing across the silent canyon with absolute authority. He shouted for her to drop the rope immediately. Johanna turned her head, her strong face pale with exhaustion and shock as she saw the broken cowboy standing at the edge of the trail. Vance spat into the dirt, angrily telling Gideon that if she dropped the rope, the gold for his leg surgery was gone forever. Gideon ignored the freight owner completely. He hobbled straight toward Johanna, stopping right in front of her despite the dangerous drop just inches away. He reached out with his calloused hands and caught the heavy tow rope, pulling it off her massive shoulders and casting it into the dirt. He looked into her gentle eyes, his weathered face tight with fierce, uncompromising. He told her that his broken leg was just a piece of his body, but her life and her safety were his entire world. He admitted he had spent weeks believing he was useless because he could no longer ride the open range, but she had taught him that a man's worth was measured by how he loved and protected the person who cared for him. He held her thick, trembling hand in his own, reminding her of the silver coins she had paid the doctor when they first reached town, when she had called it a loan to preserve his dignity. He told her they were partners, bound not by financial debts or physical power, but by an unbreakable respect. He spoke the deep truth she had waited her entire life to hear, telling her that she did not need to perform impossible feats of strength to earn her place in this world. He looked past her towering height and her wild muscular frame, telling her softly that she still mattered, not for what her body could carry, but for the gentle, magnificent heart inside her. Tears filled Johanna's eyes, spilling down her dust-stained cheeks. The heavy burden of lifelong rejection, the shame of being viewed as a spectacle, and the fear of never being truly loved vanished in the cold mountain air. She stepped forward and wrapped her massive arms around Gideon, pulling him safely against her chest. She wept silently, holding the cowboy who had given her a dignity no one could ever take away. Abernathy stepped up beside them, telling Vance his dangerous gold meant nothing on this trail, and ordered the freight driver to leave before the law was called. They returned to Oak Haven together, not as drifting survivors, but as two people who had finally found their home. The gold for the surgery was never earned, and Gideon kept his heavy limp, walking every day with a sturdy wooden cane he carved himself. Yet the loss of his physical perfection no longer carried a single drop of shame. 6 months later, the sun rose warm and bright over the main street of Oak Haven. The leather workshop at the back of Abernathy Mercantile was filled with the rich scent of oil, leather and fresh pine. Gideon sat at the sturdy oak workbench, his calloused fingers guiding a waxed thread through a pair of custom saddlebags, his work recognized as the finest in the entire territory. Beside him, Johanna lifted a heavy wooden crate of iron hardware, setting it down with gentle ease before wiping her brow. She walked over to the workbench, picking up a tin cup of fresh water, and handed it to Gideon with a quiet, knowing smile. He took the cup, his observant eyes reflecting lasting peace as he held her thick hand for a tender moment. In the evenings, they walked down the boardwalk together, the townspeople tipping their hats in genuine respect to the master craftsman and the strong, compassionate woman who kept the town moving. The frontier was still vast and unforgiving, but inside their shared home, two lonely souls had proven that love was not earned through perfection, but built stitch by stitch through quiet loyalty and unyielding devotion. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and reflective storytelling. All characters, names, dialogue, events, towns, ranches, and circumstances are fictional or dramatized. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to actual events or places is coincidental. Historical details are used to create a frontier atmosphere and may be simplified or adapted for narrative purposes. Nothing in this story should be understood as historical documentation or as legal, medical, financial, or other professional advice. The story is intended for a general audience and explores universal themes such as dignity, compassion, resilience, forgiveness, belonging, family, and second chances.